Hello, and welcome to an outrageously poor review of Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. I'm telling you now so that you don't burn me in the comments later. Seriously, not an expert reviewer. I'm not even out of high school yet, but I really hope that you enjoy hearing about my humble opinion on this topic. I read this book earlier this year, I think around April or March, and I adored it. It was my classics TBR for the longest time. I had actually DNF'd it last year when I bought it because I didn't feel like I was experienced enough to actually enjoy the book as it was, but I picked it up again this year for my quarantine readathon, which is a video that I'll just link in the cards somewhere here, and I appreciated it a lot better than I thought I would, and I really enjoyed it. It's definitely one of my favorite classics of all time. I finally brought myself to write this video essay on it, so yay for me! This is going to be a long video, so feel free to amp up the playback speed, get a snack, a drink, or look at the timestamps below in the description box if you so prefer. This video will contain spoilers for the book. I will run down the entire plot of the book later on in this video in case you need a refresher, or in case you don't really care to read it and won't mind me spoiling the book to you and telling you the entire plot basically, or maybe you want to you want to have a paper done on Lolita because of an English class or a literature class. You can just watch this video and come to your own conclusions later. Just telling you that so you keep it in mind while you watch. But anyway, I hope you enjoy it. Let's go right in. Lolita is a book written by Russian-American novelist Vladimir Nabokov and published in 1955. It is most notable for the number of controversial topics it touches upon. For example, pedophilia and sexual abuse through the eyes of an unreliable narrator. The book itself is divided into parts. The first one is where we are introduced to the situation that paved way for the entire events of the book taking place, which is 40-something-year-old Humbert, our narrator and deuteragonist, trying to plead his case in court. He enlightens the jury about his childhood and how he became enamored in a very disgusting way to underage girls. He would later define these girls as nymphets due to their sexual promiscuity or their developed sexual attributes for their age. And then he recounts how he became acquainted with a 12-year-old Dolores Haze, our second protagonist of this novel. He also explains how he seized her after becoming her stepfather and witnessing her mother's death. The second part of the story covers Humbert as he becomes a conscious figurative through his unconscious guilt that abducting his stepdaughter will bring him trouble. They hit the road and travel all over the US, staying in various hotels as Humbert comes to sexually harass Dolores under the pretense that he is in love with her. We later find out why he is pleading his case in court in a sudden turn of events that just demonstrate Humbert's intense descent into madness. So many more things go down in this book, and it is wrong in so many different ways. Lolita is perhaps Nabokov's most famous novel that he has written, and I personally think it's because of people's morbid curiosity. Also, maybe because the publishers marketed Lolita as a passionate love story or as an erotica, which is not the way that it was written, but okay. We will delve onto this topic later on in the video essay, so just put a pin on it. Nabokov was especially fond of the work that he did on Lolita for several reasons. One, it was his first novel that he wrote in English instead of his native Russian. Two, he described it as treating topics that were so different from his own experience that it pleasured him to have the creative talent to make it all real without having experienced it. And three, he considered it his most pure work, his most abstract and carefully planned. Stanley Kubrick adapted his story in 1969 and Adrian Lane did the same in 1997. The term Lolita has been adopted by mainstream culture in both a Japanese fashion current, which I think is extremely awesome, and into Western culture as a term describing a girl who is sexually promiscuous from a very young age and who is seductive towards men. The term nymphette, which was coined by Nabokov for this special occasion, was also adopted in Western culture, and there are also numerous YouTube videos and blog posts explaining or giving tips on how to become an infant, which is really disgusting how young girls can think. Now that you have a general idea of what's going on, let's delve into the analysis, shall we? We begin with a fictional foreword by a fictional psychologist who comments on Humbert's case. In this universe, Humbert is the pseudonym under which our narrator wishes to publish this book, which he will have written in prison as a memoir. Unfortunately, he dies a little before he has to stand trial for murder, and so this memoir is set to be published. Humbert begins this book with a small chapter dedicated to Lolita, the personal nickname that he gave Dolores Haze. This is the first thing that I would like to elaborate on and make clear before we go on. Dolores Haze and Lolita are two separate personas. The latter lives inside of Humbert's mind as a corrupted version of the little girl. She is a demonized personification of Humbert's deepest desires, basically. The former is the actual child who existed in this world, who had a horrible story and a really unfair culmination. The book then follows Humbert's memories as he recounts his life as a teenager. He establishes that he had a brief fling and they both desperately tried to have sex in his father's resort one summer, but ultimately failed, and then she died 4 months later. This is the parting point of Humbert's obsession, as he then becomes obsessed with from 9 to 14-year-old girls who embody his first love physically. In his adult life, Humbert couldn't bring himself to be attracted or aroused by women his own age, even though he got married. He always creeped and spied on schoolgirls when he took the train, and he solicited the services of prostitutes, who he considered the only girls who could get him off because they were very young. One in particular he was especially fond of because she lied about being 18, and he could revel in the fact that he knew otherwise, that he knew that she was at least 14 years old, and that is extremely disgusting. You know, of course, this should be the point that you realize just what kind of story this is gonna be and the way that it's going to be told. And this is especially a point where you have to realize that you're going to have to look at this story objectively and not through the lens of Humbert, because he is extremely unreliable. And we know that the story will most likely be distorted by this guy's mental instability because of what's going to come next. Okay, his wife then leaves him for a Russian taxi driver. So Humbert moves to the US and spends an awful lot of time in psychiatric wards, and he especially revels in the fact that he could deceive his psychiatrists into being sane, or more insane than he was. Anyway, I am skipping a lot of content here because I don't think it was really that important to the development of the plot, but you know, he travels and writes and stuff like that. Upon release, he later moves to New England with a family who he agreed to live with as a tenant, renting one of the rooms, but the house caught on fire. So the father of the house directs him to Charlotte Haze, who is looking for tenants so that he could stay there with them. He sees Dolores Haze for the first time as she is sunbathing in the garden, and he immediately decides to move in. In Dolores, he finds the exact image, the exact embodiment of his first love. He also finds in her the characterization of the perfect nymphette, and he goes to describe very in detail the things that he finds attractive of her physically, and how he feels like this very intense spiritual connection to her by just having seen her once. So during his stay, Humbert finds numerous ways to fulfill his fantasies and sexual desires in the form of the most minimal physical touch from Dolores. The most suggestive one being Dolores stretching her legs onto Humbert's excited lap, which effectively gets him off. This is one of the scenes that Nabokov considered that gave people the false idea of it being an erotica, which this is the most suggestive scene that there is in the entire book. Actually Nabokov himself feels like this is a misdirection because the book has no intention of appealing to the senses through that kind of imagery, and I quote, "As soon as the sexual connotation stops, the reader starts getting bored." Actually, later on in this book, Dolores alludes to references one of the hotels that Humbert and her stayed in as the hotel in which you raped me, which really doesn't sound very romantic now, does it? Anyway, during the summer, Dolores goes away to summer camp, and Charlotte, before she goes to drop her off, she gives Humbert a letter which explains that she is in love with him, and gives him an ultimatum to either marry her and stay with her or just leave as soon as she gets back. This because she feels like she wouldn't be able to see him every day, knowing that her feelings are unrequited. Humbert weighs the advantages of having Lolita as his stepdaughter, which ultimately pushes him to accept the marriage proposal, and so he becomes engaged to Charlotte Haze in order to be closer to Dolores. Now, I want to make a little parenthesis here. You will see me say Dolores and Lolita in different situations to describe Dolores Haze. And as I've said already, Dolores is the actual child and Lolita is the twisted version of her that lives in Humbert's mind. So just keep that in mind when I say Lolita, I'm talking about the fabrication that Humbert does, and when I say Dolores, I talk about the actual girl. And everything changes when Charlotte discovers a diary of Humbert where he describes in a lot of detail most of his sexual fantasies with her daughter. At this point, Humbert has already toyed with the idea of killing Charlotte in order to be alone with Dolores. Just want you to hold that thought for a little bit. Charlotte then writes letters to relatives to warn them about Humbert, and then writes a letter to him to call him a monster and such, and she just goes and she intends to run away with Dolores. She obviously does not believe a word that Humbert says when he explains that it's going to be a draft for his upcoming novel, which is a very lame excuse to make, but you know, he tried. Sadly, Charlotte gets run over by a car on her way to the post office to drop off the letters, and this is the scene that is later taken by Adrian Lyne, right? Yeah, by Adrian Lyne in his adaptation to the screen, where Dolores shouts, "Murder me like you murdered my mother," and I will play the clip right here.
Murder me like you murdered my mother.
I'm sorry.
Murder me like you murdered my mother. Go on, murder me. Murder me like you murdered my mother.
Now stop that.
Go ahead.
Stop that.
Murder me.
Just stop.
Go on, murder me.
That.
I'm asking you to murder me.
Humbert destroys the letters, takes Dolores out of summer camp with the pretense that her mother is very sick, and takes her to a hotel. Humbert considers that he will feel guilty if he rapes his stepdaughter when she is still awake, so he gives her a sleeping pill in hopes that she will be completely knocked out when he comes back from exploring the hotel lobby. You know, just irregular things that you think about. In the porch, he talks to a guy who seems to know what all of his plans are to do with Dolores. He's even a bit cynical about it, so when Humbert starts to feel a little too called out, he leaves from the situation and he goes back up to the room. He finds that Dolores is just slightly dazed and not completely asleep as he had hoped, so feeling like he would become a little guilty by raping her in that state, he just goes to sleep and says that he will do everything else tomorrow. You know, don't you just hate it when you go against your very predominant wishes of raping your stepdaughter? Yeah. Neither do I. So I had some notes written for this book right when Dolores starts narrating to Humbert how she lost her virginity in summer camp when she awakens the next day. And I think it's just interesting how Humbert expresses so much anger and jealousy at the thought that somebody else would deflower his Lolita. He even goes to consider that, I think his name is Charlie. Yeah, he even goes as far as to consider that Charlie, the boy that Dolores had her first time with, raped his Lolita, which I think it's a bit ironical for him to say. But anyway, Dolores' account of the story is expressed with mild indifference. She doesn't even express disgust or fear or regret when she's talking about her first time. She's just like, oh yeah, it just happened. And Humbert is just like infuriated. He can't even take it. It's so weird. You know, this also becomes an excuse for him to repeatedly rape Dolores without feeling guilt about it. Just the fact that she was already dirty and deflowered and she had already been desensitized, or, you know, all those synonyms that you can think of for that. And that's how he just convinces himself that it's not wrong. You know, she was already tainted by someone else. So that gave him the right to repeatedly harass her, which, yeah, it's kind of disgusting. Anyway, according to Humbert, that same day, Dolores seduces him and then they have sex, for which he rewards her by buying her things. And then he reveals that her mother is dead after she insists on phoning her or the police in order to tell them everything that happened between Dolores and Humbert himself. Just want to tell you that that seems very suspicious to me. You know, it sounds like she wanted to get away, but Humbert just kind of misinterprets this to a temper tantrum, and she's just being a brat. She wants me to spoil her. You just know that it's not that way, and you just hate Humbert so much. It's very interesting. It's an interesting experience to read this book. This is where part 1 ends, and the continuous horror of Dolores' exploitation by the hands of Humbert begins, as well as Humbert's temper and sanity starting to decay rather intensely. They start traveling, the all-American road trip, I guess you could say. There's this part where Humbert says that every time they stopped at a town, he would ask for the nearest bus stop or the nearest school, and he would just sit in his car with Dolores to ogle and lust after the little girls, after the schoolgirls who were going. He considers that since Dolores is envious of them and of how he pays more attention to them rather than her, she starts mocking him and bothering him in order to get attention. The fact that he even thinks that Dolores is just being a snobby girl, wanting his affection, is disgusting already, but the fact that Dolores might have tried to convince him to knock it off is actually kind of depressing. He also gets extremely jealous and possessive over Dolores during this trip. He perceived her as being way too inviting whenever they stopped at, for example, a gas station. You know, he considered that she was seducing every single male figure that they encountered during the road trip. During this time is also when Humbert starts hallucinating Charlotte's dead face during a time where they stayed at a hotel and Dolores was playing tennis in the court. He is starting to go crazy, and he's also starting to depend emotionally on Dolores to keep him grounded into reality, and unfortunately the way that she grounds him is by being sexual. He also starts secreting Dolores in his thoughts, you know, calling her a slut, calling her dirty, calling her promiscuous, and he is even provoked by the way she walks. Anyway, after 2 years of bribing her for sexual favors and for her silence, while also convincing himself that Dolores is just a whimsical child who throws temper tantrums all the time, Humbert starts considering settling in somewhere and getting a job and enrolling Dolores in school. So that's what happens next. Humbert is hired as a professor at a university, and he enrolls Dolores in an all-girls school that is nearby. And of course they pose as father and daughter. Even though Humbert forbids her of dating or going out a lot, Dolores seems to like it in the new school and seems to make friends as well. The headmistress inquires Humbert. She thinks that something wrong might be going on at home. Unfortunately, Humbert convinces her that he is merely being a strict European father, but she does manage to sway him to let Dolores participate in the school play, which will be attended by its writer, Claire Quilty. Humbert and Dolores start having fights, and after a particularly bad one, Dolores' attitude completely changes. She tells Humbert that she wants to go back on the road, to which he accepts. Shortly after, he starts to become paranoid. He thinks that somebody resembling his uncle is following them around while they are on the road. He's also becoming anxious that Dolores might be talking to the other guy while they are making stops. And he also has this vague notion that she wants to run away with him. It doesn't last very long though, as Humbert manages to tell himself that he's just being paranoid, and they continue on with their adventure. Dolores unexpectedly falls ill, and she's taken to the hospital in the nearest town. She has to stay there for a few days, but Humbert finds her gone when he comes to pick her up. The hospital staff tells him that she left with her uncle, and Humbert then realizes that all his suspicions were true in the end. Humbert spends the rest of the summer trying to find her, but he fails in tracking her down. He starts a relationship with an alcoholic named Rita, and it isn't until 2 years later that he receives a letter from Dolores asking for financial aid. She's 17, she's married, and she's pregnant. She doesn't even give an address, but Humbert still manages to track her down either way. He thinks that Lolita has married the guy that had been following them and who took her away from him, so he goes and visits Dolores with the intention of killing the guy. Dolores is actually married a deaf engineer named Dick, so Humbert decides not to kill him. He does want to know who Lolita had an affair with, and she reluctantly spills the beans. It was Claire Quilty, the playwright of her school play, as well as the guy that Humbert had encountered in the hotel lobby the first time that he ran away with Dolores. Dolores had fallen in love with him, but left when Quilty had asked her to participate in his child pornography films. So Humbert gives her the money that she asked for and begs Dolores to run away with him. Realizing that he truly does love her, she is taken aback by this at first, but ultimately refuses, which sends Humbert driving away in tears. This is a climactic point for Humbert as he comes to realize and to think about how he actually hurt and everything that he took away from Dolores. He has a new motivation now, to kill Claire Quilty. He tracks down the playwright and visits him at his house. Quilty is actually drunk and unimpressed, and he does try to negotiate for his life. The fight scene that follows is actually a parody of the Western genre of Hollywood movies with several missed shots and a lot of struggling and wrestling. In the end, Humbert manages to put some holes in Quilty, who is very theatrical and dramatic about his death, even reciting a couple of lines from plays, until he ultimately falls. Humbert is arrested and then he dies in prison, and Dolores dies of childbirth to a stillborn girl. It is a very surreal kind of novel that feels like a fever dream the entire time, and I know I say this about a lot of books that I read, that they all feel like a fever dream, but it is true. I believe that the formatting of the novel heavily contributed to it feeling this way to me. There were no page breaks in between the chapters, and the imagery of summer in a small American town just it kind of gave me the vibes like the way that the US portrays Mexico in TV shows. Besides the fact that it was established to be a diary, I don't know, all of those elements kind of contributed to it feeling like a fever dream. The prologue is extremely important to understanding the lens through which Nabokov wants us to read this novel. The entire page is actually a parody. It frames the story as a work of psychological study instead of a piece of literature. It makes everything feel real even though everything is entirely fictional and we know it. The prologue is an introduction. It gives you like a what happened to the people who participated in this book, the characters of this novel. Actually, Vivian Darkbloom is one of the characters who were in this. It is one of the names. This is actually an anagram for Vladimir Nabokov. And I think it's just really funny that he does find a way to make a cameo and just self-insert in every single one of his works. It's not the only one that he makes the cameo in. But back to the prologue, there are several points that the psychologist makes in favor of the novel being published, which parallel Humbert's excuses for raping Lolita. One, that if the work of art is so marvelous and breathtaking, it immediately cancels out the immorality of the content, which parallels Humbert abusing Dolores with the excuse that he is in love with her and that he has good intentions. And two, that if the critics found this work to be obscene, there were already worse immoral works in the American literature scene anyway, like Ulysses by James Joyce. This parallels Humbert because he considers that Dolores has been tainted already by Charlie when she lost her virginity to him in summer camp, and thus raping her is actually not that big of a deal. And finally, the doctor invites us to take this story as a moral lesson, which is completely ironical to what Nabokov actually thinks of this specific work and literature in general, and this is something that I will come back to later on in the video. Apparently, although Nabokov didn't directly confirm it or anything, this story is inspired by the case of Sally Horner. There's several people who have this theory that the Sally Horner case directly inspired Lolita. However, that is not true, but I will still go through the Sally Horner case. Nabokov, however, does reference this case in the novel as something that Humbert asks himself when he's having his emotional climax and questioning if he really did hurt Lolita by saying, and I quote, "Had I done to Dolly perhaps what Frank LaSalle, a 50-year-old mechanic, had done to the 11-year-old Sally Horner in 1948? Let me get a little bit into what actually happened here. First of all, every single article that I could find online on this matter had the eye-catching title of The Real Lolita, the story that influenced Lolita, the real case that inspired Lolita, blah, blah, blah. Sally was born in New Jersey in 1937 and died in 1952, aged 15. Her father had committed suicide when she was a lot younger, and she lived with her mother. So in 1948, when Sally was around 10 or 11 years old, she had attempted to shoplift a notebook from a store in order to fit in with some of the girls of her school, I believe. A guy claiming to be an FBI agent stopped her and told her that she would be in a lot of trouble for trying to steal. This guy was actually 50-year-old Frank LaSalle, who had been released from prison just 6 months prior for the crime of child molesting. He told her that he would be monitoring her from now on, and 3 months later, after constant following her, he told Sally to come down to Atlantic City with him because they needed to go to an FBI office there. He instructed her to tell her mother that she was just going to a trip with some of the girls in her class, that he was the father of some of her friends, and that she would be just going to New Jersey Shore on vacation with them. But her mother believed, and she allowed her to go because they were very poor, and this is part of the police report. I'm pretty sure this is part of what she said to the authorities when she reported her child missing. Anyway, LaSalle and Sally Horner posed as father and daughter as they were traveling, and Sally even phoned her mom several times during the trip. But finally, in July, she filed a missing child alert. Frank LaSalle fled Atlantic City with Sally and moved to Baltimore, where he raped her, and he used the constant threat of reporting her shoplifting in order to keep her submissive. With the new school year starting at the end of August, LaSalle decided to enroll Sally in, I think, Baltimore Catholic school under a pseudonym, and they continued to live there for 6 months. Then they moved forward to Texas, where Sally was again enrolled in another Catholic school. During this time, she still believed that Frank was an FBI agent. In early 1950, they headed to San Jose. While LaSalle was away job searching, Sally confessed the truth to one of the neighbors and told her that she missed her mother and that she wanted to go home. The neighbor invited her to make a long-distance phone call to New Jersey, after which they contacted the police, who took the almost 13-year-old girl to a children's shelter and arrested LaSalle upon his arrival home that same day. And he did spend the rest of his life in prison for that. 2 years later, in August 1952, now 15-year-old Sally went on a summer trip to the New Jersey Shore with a friend. Using a fake ID to disguise herself as 21-year-old, she began dating a 20-year-old guy named Edward Baker, telling him that she was 17. So there's like a lot of conflict here with the ages, but I'm pretty sure that you're following up. While riding in Baker's car on August 18, she was killed when Baker slammed into the rear of a truck that he had been unable to see in the darkness. Obviously, there are parallels in this story, which had happened a little bit before Nabokov started writing Lolita. The most obvious being the overall situation of an 11-year-old girl being abducted by an older man, taken on a road trip across the country, and being enrolled in school under the pretense of being her captor's daughter, despite the fact that they were also molested repeatedly during their trip. Keep in mind that this case was actually in Nabokov's mind when he was writing his novel, as we can see by the reference that he did later on in the book, but this wasn't the direct inspiration for his story. Anyway, we will discuss this later on, but the writing is exquisite, and it's actually one of Nabokov's only novels that were written in English. He considered that it eclipsed all of his other English stories. It is full of references to other writers, Poe being the most predominantly mentioned, even imitating and parodying the famous stream of consciousness that was present in Joyce's Ulysses. All of this literary knowledge in which we are soaked in through the writing comes from Humbert being a well-read scholar and an English teacher. The writing style translates extremely well from his psyche, and it is very evident and interesting to read about Humbert's descent into insanity, how his train of thought starts shifting and changing into a more grotesque form of it from where we started off, then his shift to a intense depression when he lost Dolores, and his final climax of anger and determination to try to make amends with himself for what he did to her, also by avenging Dolores. When he kills Claire Quilty, you can tell that he also killed a part of himself with him, especially seeing how similar both pedophiles were in essence. This was a very chaotic character arc, to be honest with you, and I personally really enjoyed how we got to look into the mind of this twisted and dark character and found it very fascinating. The moral debate of Lolita. Many people have the opinion that the author must have a moral compromise when writing a story, and they consider that Nabokov had absolutely none when writing such a crude story. First of all, Nabokov adored Lolita, the novel. It was something that he really spent a lot of brain power on. He later cleared up that his novel had no moral to the story, which is the irony that happens in the prologue, and that this work of art was only made for the purpose of the aesthetic pleasure of the writing. That is the way that he generally thought about literature, and that's the mindset that he held when writing this story. Dolores' life journey is tragic. She had a very miserable life ever since Humbert came into it, which ended in a premature death. There are tons of critics and people who have actually in-depth studied literature who can say this a lot better than I can, honestly. Elizabeth Janeway, for example, when writing for the New York Times, says, and I quote, "Humbert is every man who is driven by desire, wanting his Lolita so badly that it never occurs to him to consider her as a human being, or as anything but a dream figment made of flesh." There's this other debate, I guess, that I saw in a Sarah Hawkinson video called Why Fictional Killer Merch Isn't as Bad as Serial Killer Merch, in which I think we can apply here. So it is something that we can also compare to The Haunting of Sharon Tate, or The Murder of Nicole Brown Simpson, both movies made by the same director, and which were capitalizing on real-life tragedies that actually happened to real people. This is also a point which I would love to take from Dana Alquati on her video on The Haunting of Sharon Tate. When you come in with this idea that Sally Horner was the direct inspiration for this novel, it comes to be very harmful for the piece of literature when you are reading it, and it prevents you from coming into it with an open mind and without this premonitioned idea. You might also become concerned that this might have been harmful for the actual person who lived. The reason that I bring this up in the video is because I had a 2 or 3 comment debate on the comment section of a Jesse the Reader video on his anti-TBR tag, where he expressed that he wouldn't ever read Lolita because it made him uncomfortable, and I totally get that. This book is something that should make you uncomfortable, and it's a very, very crude story, so I do get why it made a lot of people so uncomfortable and why they wouldn't want to actually read it. It's totally normal and it's totally fine. I answered to this one comment in the comment section, and I explained that Lolita was actually a case study and blah blah blah. I just did like a very small paragraph on what I thought and how it is very important that we appreciate this with an objective lens rather than the morality of it. Then the point was brought to me about the Sally Horner case and how it was wrong for Nabokov to purposely glorify this case and capitalize on it, and how hard it must have been for the victim to see her life experience immortalized on paper. So first, I do want to say this in the most matter-of-fact way possible, but Sally Horner died in 1952 and Lolita was published in 1955. And it is true, though, that Nabokov started writing the story the year that she died, that Sally Horner died. Regardless, Nabokov started introducing the concept of a middle-aged man booking into a hotel with his victim posing to be father and daughter back when he started writing his Russian work, The Enchanted, in 1939. It wasn't published until much later on, after Lolita was published, but he started writing this in 1939, and that's when he started toying with the idea. I personally believe, because I'm exactly the same way when I'm writing, that he did have this idea on the back of his head about these two characters, and after a while he started having the heart or the voice to start writing that. Perhaps the Sally Horner case was incentivized him to start writing it, or maybe it wasn't. But the actual question here is, how ethical or moral is it to write stories based on real life events? Is it any worse to actually write a direct retelling of a crime or a tragedy that happened? And just how moral that actually is as well. Let's take the Texas Chainsaw Massacre films as an example. We all know that there was no actual Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but the killer Leatherface in this movie was inspired by an actual real-life killer, Ed Gein. He also inspired numerous killers in other films like Psycho or The Silence of the Lambs. Ed Gein was famous, or rather infamous, for having exhumed the bodies of several women in order to make items and furniture out of human bones and their skins. There's entire videos on it. There are countless newspaper articles. If you want to, if you're into true crime, you probably already heard about this. Of course, since there is no direct association with the films with the real life killer, there is no harm done. You couldn't say that we are disrespecting the victims by watching this movie, or that these movies being produced is actually harmful to the victims or harmful to the image of the killer. It is not real. In my opinion, this is the same case for Lolita. But if you are not entirely satisfied with this, let's delve into films made by Ference. Daniel Ference's filmography is very problematic. He started off as a documentary filmmaker, but then he kind of transitioned into the movie realm by producing things in the style of dramatic recounts of documentary sprinkled with a lot of fiction. To be more specific, let's talk about two of his most recent movies, which are also the most polemic: The Haunting of Sharon Tate and The Murder of Nicole Brown Simpson. These were directly taken from the events of these two women who were viciously murdered and whose stories you might already know, because Nicole Brown Simpson's murder, O.J. Simpson was the trial of the century, and well, Sharon Tate is one of the most famous cases of the Charles Manson cult. Many people, myself included, consider these films to be atrocious on both a technical and a moral level. The first movie about Sharon Tate even had Sharon Tate's sister filing for a possible lawsuit for actually producing this movie, and for how harmful it was for the image of Sharon Tate, and just how horrific all this was for her sister and her family. The movie was actually inspired on one interview that Sharon Tate had 1 year before she was murdered, where she was asked if she had supernatural premonitions and stuff, and she said that she just had one dream once where found her and her friend with her throats slashed in the living room, and then 1 year later, when she was 8.5 months pregnant, her and 4 friends were murdered in her, I think it's her LA residence, by Charles Manson and his family. The film basically milks this tragedy for profit while also having Tate have supernatural premonitions of her death, and there's also this fake woke dialogue on how you can change the future or if you can change your destiny and stuff like that. The video that Sarah Hawkinson did, and if you're a Spanish speaker, the video that Dana Guati did on this movie, they're both extremely well at explaining why this is morally wrong. I'll leave them in the description because I mostly took the summary of the movie from those two videos. There is no further explanation on why these movies are so wrong to have been made. Or we can also talk about the Amityville murder movies, or The Exorcism of Emily Rose was heavily inspired by The Exorcism of Annalise Michel, which is a true crime video that BuzzFeed has at their BuzzFeed Unsolved. You know, the difference between Ference Productions, for example, and all of these other films, and well, let's also take Lolita in it, why not, is that while being quite similar in content and perhaps taking direct inspiration from the events that actually happened, we are looking at fiction. You know, as I want to stress for you, it is not real. It did not happen. And in the words of Sarah Hawkinson and how she said it in the video, was it made to give a moral lesson, to inform, or to just simply entertain? Anyway, I think that's all I have to tell you for this video. It was really fun to write. It was really fun to film. Thank you so much for watching. I really seriously recommend this book to anybody who is into classics and who wants to get into the Russians. The Russians are very known for their pessimistic or of their insightful views on literature, and how they're more like developed on the psyche, how they're rawer, colder works instead of like more fantastical, or they could be fantastical but they are also very cold, I guess. So yeah, I really do recommend Lolita. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you subscribe, you like it, you share it, all of that fun stuff. Ring the bell for notifications. I don't know this YouTuber stuff. But yeah, if you did like this, leave a comment below. If you want to recommend any other classic or any other book, I'll be gladly sure to read it somewhere in the future. Maybe I have it in my TBR already, who knows. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.